Well, for those of you who still think that the New York Times is a part of the liberal media conspiracy, I have some news for you today. Because essentially the way I see it is they could practically merge with the Wall Street Journal at this point as far as most of their editorial opinions go. So Glenn Greenwald has posted an article on his site, which is published through the magazine Salon, and I'll post a link to it, which bears reading, or rather listening to, which is why I'm putting this out there. There's been a major editorial breach at the New York Times today in this obituary of an American fighter pilot who was captured by the Chinese. Now remember, this is an obituary. Harold Fisher, an American flyer tortured in a Chinese prison, dies at the age of 83. From April 1953 through May 1955, Colonel Fisher, then an Air Force captain, was held at a prison outside Mukden, Manchuria. For most of the time, he was kept in a dark, damp cell with no bed and no opening except a slot in the door through which a bowl of food could be pushed. Much of the time, he was handcuffed. Hour after hour, a high-frequency whistle pierced the air. This is directly from this obituary. After a short mock trial in Beijing on May 24, 1955, Captain Fisher and the other pilots were found guilty of violating Chinese territory by flying across the border while on missions over North Korea. Under duress, Captain Fisher had falsely confessed to participating in germ warfare. So, that's torture now. To use the prevailing American mindset, and this is Glenn Greenwald talking here now, a room that doesn't meet the standards of a Hilton and some whistling in the background is torture. My neighbor whistles all the time. Does that mean he's torturing me? It's not as though Fisher had his eyes poked out by hot irons or was placed in a coffin-like box with the bugs or was handcuffed to the ceiling. Also, using the editorial standards of America's journalistic institutions, as explained recently by the New York Times public editor, shouldn't this be called torture rather than harsh tactics some critics decry as torture? Why are there much less brutal methods used by the Chinese on Fisher called torture by the New York Times, whereas much harsher methods used by the Americans do not merit that term? Here we find what is clearly the single most predominant fact shaping our political and media discourse. Everything is different and better when we do it. In fact, that is exactly the mentality that was and continues to be primary justification for our torture regime and pretty much everything else we do. Along the same lines, I learned from reading the New York Times this week via the New York's Amy Davidson that Iraq is suffering very serious problems. Tragically, that country is struggling with what the Times calls a culture of impunity. What this means is that politically connected Iraqis, who clearly broke the law, are nonetheless not being prosecuted. because of their political influence. Even worse, protests the New York Times, there have been cases dismissed in the past few years as a result of a government amnesty and a law dating back to 1971 that allows ministers to grant immunity to subordinates accused of corruption. Sound familiar? And the best part is this. The United States is pressing the Iraqi government to repeal that law. Thankfully, we're teaching the Iraqis what it means to be a nation of laws. We Americans know how terrible it is to have a system where the potentially powerful are permitted to break the law and are not being held accountable. A country which does things like that can fall into such a moral state of depravity that they could actually allow people to do things like this and get away with it. Who could imagine living in a place like that? I urge you to read the rest of Glenn Greenwald's article. Now, the Salon site is, you don't have to subscribe to it, but it kind of goes per view count, so you might be blocked from reading too many articles on there, because then you do have to subscribe. Anyway, it's a pretty interesting state of affairs in terms of the hypocrisy coming from our major news media. And don't forget, New York Times articles are being taken up by TV networks as well. So it's not just this publication which many of us can't even afford to buy, let alone read every day. But this information is being filtered down via, and who would have guessed, the mainstream media. So this is my little vlog for tonight, so I'm hoping that others will chime in and let's get the political discourse going again, because it's been quite absent here for some time, and we can't just we can't just sit by and say, well, we're all going to hell. If everyone does this, nothing is ever going to change. So let's at least try to keep people informed. Thanks.